Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the world of mixed martial arts. We're going past the knockouts and the spectacle to look at the economic engine driving it all.
That's right. We're talking about a massive legal fight over how fighters get paid and really who controls the entire sport.
And to do that, we're diving into a stack of expert economic reports from a class action lawsuit against Zuffa LLC.
Which is, of course, the parent company of the UFC. And these reports lay out a case that Zuffa holds two very specific kinds of power.
Okay, so the first is power over the product itself, the events they sell to you and me.
Right, that's monopoly power, your classic ability to control the supply and price of live MMA events.
But the second one is where this whole thing gets really interesting. It's power over the labor market.
That's monopsony power, and that's the key here. It's power over the fighters themselves.
So monopoly is being the only seller. Monopsony is being essentially the only buyer of top-tier talent.
Precisely. And our mission today is to unpack how Zuffa allegedly used its contracts, these really restrictive long-term contracts, to hold on to that power, keep fighter pay down, and, block out any real competition.
Yeah.
So to really get this, you have to define the playground. The analysis first looks at the relevant output market.
That's the product they sell.
Exactly. Live MMA events broadcast in North America. And the sources are pretty clear on this. Zuffa's market share has been around 90% by revenue since at least 2008.
90%. So for every $10 you spend on a major MMA event, $9 of those dollars go straight to Zuffa.
Yeah.
I mean, that is just a staggering level of control.
It is. And that control over the product is directly tied to their control over the fighters.
So how do they work? How do they translate that into dominating the labor market?
Well, that brings us to the relevant input market, the fighters. But the economists make a really important distinction here. They zero in on a relevant input submarket.
The headliners.
The headliners. And they define that as fighters ranked 1 through 15 in the major weight classes.
Okay, but why is that group so important? I mean, aren't all fighters part of the input?
They are, but the headliners are the secret sauce. The experts argue that, big audiences, the ones that buy the pay-per-views, they're drawn to fights between high-ranked opponents.
Right. You want to see the best fight the best.
Exactly. So if you control the top 15 fighters in every division, you control what a legitimate high-stakes fight even is. You become the only place to be.
The inevitable destination for any other fighter who wants to make a name for themselves.
And the numbers back this up. The analysis showed Zuffa had foreclosed, which is a legal term for locking up in exclusive contracts, more than 70% of those headliners since around 2013.
70%. That is a massive number in any industry. It basically means no one else can even get the ingredients to put on a competing show.
Right. A competitor can't access enough top talent to be viable. So you have dominant market share on the output side, this huge foreclosure share on the input side, and what the reports call substantial barriers to entry.
Meaning rivals just couldn't get off the ground.
Time and time again, they failed to become profitable. And this combination is what leads the economists to conclude that Zuffa had both monopoly and monopsony power.
So they have this power. Let's talk about the mechanics. How specifically did they use the contracts to keep that power locked down?
It really boils down to a 1-2 punch of contract duration and some really restrictive terms within them.
Okay, let's start with duration.
Well, first you have to understand a fighter's career. It is brutally short. The median career length for the Zuffa fighters they looked at was just 0.82 years. The average was 2 years.
Less than a year for the median fighter. That's nothing. Your window to make money is tiny.
It's a blink of an eye. And yet the contracts they sign are anything but short. Especially for the top guys.
For the champions and the headliners?
Exactly. For the top 5 ranked fighters in 2015, the median contract duration was 50 months.
Over 4 years. So your entire effective career and then some is owned by one company. You have zero leverage.
Zero. But the most powerful tool, the one the reports really hammer home, is the right to match clause.
Okay, let's break this down because this is the core of it.
It is. So this clause means that if a fighter's contract ends and a rival, say Bellator, makes them an offer,
Zuffa gets to see that offer.
Yes. And all they have to do is match it. They don't have to beat it. They just have to match it. And if they do, the fighter is forced to stay.
And the economics of that are just brutal for the fighter because that rival's offer isn't the fighter's true value.
Not at all. It's the bare minimum the rival thinks they can get away with. So Zuffa gets to keep the fighter not for what they're actually worth to Zuffa, what economists call their marginal revenue product, or MRP.
But for the lowest possible number some other company offered. Zuffa basically pockets the entire difference.
They capture what's called the entirety of the surplus. It's a masterclass in suppressing pay.
And we see this play out in the real world. The sources mention the fighter Gilbert Melendez. A rival made him an offer. Zuffa just matched it, and that was that. He had to stay.
Exactly. And you see the other side of the coin with someone like Andrei Arlovski. Zuffa let him go in 2009 when they were, quote, no longer interested. He fought elsewhere, rebuilt his career, and then came back years later.
So his ability to leave wasn't about his contract being up. It was about Zuffa deciding he wasn't essential to them anymore.
It highlights that mobility was often at Zuffa's discretion.
And on top of that, there's this practice of restricted supply.
Yeah, which is basically signing way more fighters than you have fights for.
So you're keeping them on the bench.
You're keeping them on the bench, which hurts their earning potential, and maybe more importantly, you're keeping them away from your competitors. You're hoarding the talent so no one else can use it.
Okay, so we've got the theory, we got the contract mechanisms. Where's the proof of harm? The experts point to two key areas.
Yeah.
What consumers paid and what fighters got paid.
Let's start with the consumer side. This is the monopoly power in action. Between 2010 and 2015, Zuffa pushed through a 24% price hike on their residential pay-per-views.
And classic monopoly theory says if you jack up the price, fewer people will buy.
And that's exactly what happened. They saw a 17% drop in PPV buys over that same time. So they made more money from fewer customers. It's a textbook move when you don't have to worry about competition.
Okay, now let's get to the fighter pay side. This is where it gets really fascinating because it becomes this academic battle over how you even measure fair pay.
Right. The plaintiffs' economists use a metric called fighter share. So not the absolute dollar amount a fighter gets, but what percentage of the total event revenue their compensation represents.
And they base this on studies of other major sports, right?
Yeah. They point to pioneering work by guys like Professor Scully in baseball. He showed that before free agency, when players were locked to one team for life, their share of revenue was really low.
But the second free agency hit, and players could sell their skills to the highest bidder.
The wage share shot up. In MLB, the NBA, the NFL, the argument is that the UFC is basically operating in a pre-free agency world. The fighter's share of the pie is artificially suppressed.
And what's wild is Zuffa's own experts argued against this. They said, no, you can only look at the absolute dollar amount.
But the rebuttal was just devastating because the plaintiffs found internal Zuffa documents presentations for the sale to WME-IMG, where Zuffa itself was analyzing athlete costs as a share of revenue.
So they were telling their own investors one thing, and their experts were arguing the exact opposite in court.
It's a powerful contradiction. And then you have the sponsorship tax.
This one is so direct, so easy to understand.
It really is. Zuffa basically imposed a new rule. If a company wanted to sponsor a fighter, they had to pay Zuffa a fee first.
Which effectively takes money that would have gone directly into the fighter's pocket and diverts it to the company.
And the sources have these really granular examples. A manager talking about losing an $8,000 sponsorship for one of his fighters.
Because the sponsor just couldn't afford to pay both the fighter and the Zuffa tax.
Exactly. And there are text messages from fighters saying they were losing a ton of money. That's not an abstract economic model. That's rent. That's a car payment. It's direct evidence of Zuffa's power to just unilaterally cut fighter compensation. So, of course, Zuffa has a defense. Their main argument is that all of this is just, pro-competitive conduct.
The "we built this sport" argument.
Pretty much. Our promoter acumen and our investment is what made MMA legitimate. Our dominance is just the reward for our success.
And even Zuffa's own expert, Dr. Topol, kind of admits that their success comes from getting all the best fighters in one place. The best want to fight the best.
Right. But the rebuttal from the plaintiff side is, okay, your conduct did grow the revenue, but then you used your market power to capture all of that new value instead of sharing it with the fighters who created it.
And they push back on the idea that Zuffa developed all this talent from scratch.
They do. The data showed that 38% of the headliners who fought for Zuffa first reached that top-tier status at another promotion.
So they were often poaching established stars, not just building them from the ground up.
A significant amount of the time, yes.
And what about the Zuffa myth? The idea that they single-handedly legitimized the sport, wrote the rules.
The sources really go after that. They include, for example, a letter from the New Jersey Deputy Attorney General who basically says, no, New Jersey created the unified rules, not you.
It's an effort to show that their dominance came from locking down the market, not just from being brilliant pioneers.
And you see that in how they treated their rivals. The smaller promotions like Bellator and Strikeforce, they actually did pro-competitive things.
Like what?
They'd put Zuffa out clauses in their contracts, which let a fighter leave penalty-free if they got a UFC offer. They would co-promote events.
Things that help fighters and grow the sport overall.
Right. But Zuffa avoided that. One of their executives is on record admitting they didn't want to co-promote with Bellator because they were afraid it would give their rival a boost.
Which is what a monopolist would do, not someone in a competitive market.
That's the argument, yes.
Okay, so this all leads to the billion-dollar question. What is the actual cost? What does this but-for world, a world without these restrictive contracts, actually look like for fighter pay?
This is the core of the damages model. The economists built a simulation of a competitive market where Zuffa's foreclosure share, that 70% number, drops to a maximum of 30%.
A world where fighters have real options.
Exactly. And in that but-for world, they project that fighters would have been paid roughly 69% of Zuffa's event revenue.
69%. Wait a minute. Say that again.
69, nearly 70%.
And what were they actually getting?
During the class period, the actual number was 19.5%.
So they're arguing that in a fair market, the fighter's share of the pie would be more than 3 times bigger? How do they even justify a number that high?
By looking at the higher wage shares that competitors like Strikeforce and Bellator actually paid, and by using the historical data from when other sports introduced free agency, when you have to truly compete for talent, the price of that talent goes way up.
So what does that gap between 19.5% and 69% add up to in actual dollars? What's the total damage estimate?
The aggregate damages, the amount the analysis says was suppressed from fighters' paychecks, comes out to $1.6 billion over the class period.
$1.5 billion. That is just a staggering figure.
It is. The model projects that total payments should have been around $2.2 billion. That's the gravity of the claim.
And that but-for world isn't just about more money. It's a fundamental change in the power structure.
Oh, absolutely. You'd see much shorter contracts, probably a year or less. The right to match clause would be gone. You'd have real fighter mobility.
More crossover fights between promotions.
For sure. All of this would force Zuffa to either pay what the fighters are actually worth their MRP or risk losing them to a real viable competitor.
So at the end of the day, this whole legal fight is about whether a dominant company used these complex restrictive contracts to keep its most essential resource, the fighters, from getting what the open market would say they deserve.
That's the heart of it. And, the historical parallel is powerful. When free agency came to other major sports, the share of revenue going to players rose dramatically, and it never went back down. If the court agrees with this analysis, it could completely reshape the business of MMA.
And maybe not just MMA.
That's the thing to think about. What changes might you see in any sport where one single organization controls nearly 90% of all the revenue?
A question that's very much up in the air. Thanks for helping us break down the economics behind the fight. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.